The late afternoon sun burned gently over a quiet industrial town in Michigan. Broken sidewalks, flickering streetlights, and the echo of passing cars painted the rhythm of everyday struggle. Among the noise and heat, a young man named Ethan Carter, barely 20, walked slowly along the roadside, his worn sneakers scraping the pavement. On his back hung a large, torn plastic bag filled with discarded bottles, cans, and bits of metal. His clothes were dusty, his face tired, but his eyes, deep and quiet, still carried a glimmer of honesty. Since his parents' death years ago, Ethan had been on his own. No relatives, no real friends, just survival. College had never been an option. Even finishing high school had been a miracle. Each morning, he walked through back alleys and behind supermarkets collecting recyclables to trade for a few dollars at the recycling depot. Some called him Trash Boy. Others didn't even notice him. But he had long stopped caring. As long as he could afford a sandwich and a night's rest at the small shelter downtown, that was enough. That afternoon, the humidity pressed down like a blanket. Ethan's throat was dry. He paused near a gas station, bent down to grab a crushed water bottle from the gutter, and that's when he saw it. A brown leather wallet lying in the dirt beside the curb. He froze. For a long moment, he just stared. The wallet looked expensive. Definitely not something anyone from his world could afford. His heartbeat quickened. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he picked it up and brushed away the dust. Inside were a few $100s, an ID card, and a photograph. A woman in a crisp police uniform with a soft, confident smile. Her name read Sergeant Grace Miller, Michigan Police Department. Ethan's stomach twisted. That amount of money could feed him for weeks. He imagined warm meals, clean clothes, maybe even a bed of his own. The temptation burned inside him, whispering, "No one saw you. You need it more than her." But then, another voice spoke, softer but stronger. "This isn't yours, Ethan." He took a deep breath, pressed the wallet against his chest, and whispered to himself, "I have to give this back." That night, after hours of hesitation, he gathered the courage to walk to the police station. The tall glass doors reflected his ragged image, a young man in torn jeans and an oversized hoodie that had lost its color. Inside, officers moved with purpose. One of them eyed him suspiciously as he approached the counter. "Can I help you?" the officer asked, folding his arms. Ethan swallowed hard. I found this wallet near the gas station." The officer took it, checked the name, and raised an eyebrow. "Sergeant Miller's, huh?" Wait here. Moments later, a woman in her early 30s appeared, wearing a neat police uniform and a tired yet graceful expression. When her eyes met Ethan's, something softened in her face. She opened the wallet carefully. Everything was intact. "You didn't take a single dollar," she said, astonished. Ethan looked down. "It wasn't mine to take, ma'am." Sergeant Miller smiled, a warm, genuine smile that somehow reached her weary heart. "Thank you," she whispered. For the first time in years, Ethan felt seen, not as a scavenger, but as a man of worth. The next few days passed like any other for Ethan. Morning meant wandering through the alleys behind diners and grocery stores, his gloves sticky from soda cans, his back sore from hours of bending. Yet something inside him had changed. Every time he picked up another empty bottle, he remembered the soft smile of Sergeant Grace Miller, the policewoman whose wallet he had returned without taking a cent. That brief exchange at the station replayed in his mind like a quiet melody. For someone who had spent most of his life invisible, her simple "thank you" had felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Grace, on the other hand, couldn't get Ethan out of her thoughts either. After her husband's death 2 years ago in a line-of-duty accident, her world had turned gray. Work filled the silence, but when she came home, the emptiness pressed on her chest like a weight. That night, when a ragged young man had walked into the police station holding her wallet as if it were sacred, she had seen something she thought no longer existed: raw honesty. On Saturday afternoon, Grace stopped by a local farmer's market on her way home. She wore jeans, a light blue shirt, and a cap that partly hid her badge. As she crossed the parking lot, she noticed a familiar figure crouched near a dumpster behind the market. Ethan, sorting bottles into a large plastic sack. His shirt was drenched in sweat, his hair stuck to his forehead, but his movements were steady, careful, disciplined. Grace hesitated for a moment, then called softly, "Hey, Ethan?" Startled, he looked up, his face flushed with nervousness. "Sergeant Miller," he said, standing quickly, brushing dust from his pants. She smiled faintly. "You remembered my name." "Of course," he said, eyes lowered. "It's the least I could do after how kind you were." Grace stepped closer, noticing the small cuts on his hands, the tired look in his eyes. "You work hard," she said quietly. "Do you ever get a day off?" Ethan gave a small laugh. "Days off don't pay for food, ma'am." That answer tugged at her heart. For a moment, she thought of the neglected backyard behind her home, overgrown weeds, cracked flower pots, the bench her husband had built now buried in dry leaves. "I could use some help at my place," she said after a pause. "Just the garden. It's a mess, and I haven't had the time." "It's not much, but I can pay you fairly." Ethan froze, almost not believing what he'd heard. "You'd really trust me with that?" Grace nodded. "You returned my wallet when you could have taken everything. I think I can trust you with a few plants." For the first time in months, Ethan smiled, a genuine wide smile that reached his tired eyes. "Thank you, ma'am." "I'll do my best. Call me Grace," she said softly. The next morning, Ethan showed up at her small suburban home. The backyard was just as she had described, wild, forgotten, and quiet. As he rolled up his sleeves and began to work, Grace stood by the porch watching him. His hands were rough, his clothes old, but every motion spoke of care and sincerity. For the first time in a long while, her home didn't feel empty. By the end of the first week, the backyard had started to change. The once tangled weeds were trimmed, the soil looked darker and alive, and the cracked flower pots now held small green shoots pushing toward the sunlight. Ethan worked from early morning till late afternoon, refusing to take long breaks. Every movement was quiet and deliberate, as if he was tending to something sacred. Grace often watched him from the kitchen window while sipping her coffee, finding an unexpected calm in the rhythm of his work. One afternoon, she walked outside carrying a plate of sandwiches and a glass of lemonade. Ethan was kneeling by the flower bed, his hands stained with soil. "You should rest for a while," she said. You've been at it since morning." He looked up surprised, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. "I'm okay, ma'am. I mean, Grace. I just want to finish this patch before sunset." She smiled. "And you will. But even heroes need lunch." Ethan laughed softly. It had been years since anyone had cared enough to call him anything close to a hero. He took the plate hesitantly, sitting on the edge of the porch. Grace sat across from him, the evening light falling gently over them. For a few minutes, neither spoke. The sound of cicadas filled the air. "This place," Ethan said quietly, "it's beautiful." "Just needed a little care," Grace's eyes softened. "That's what my husband used to say." She looked toward the garden, remembering the afternoons they used to spend there before everything changed. "After he passed, I couldn't bring myself to fix it." It just felt easier to let it fade. Ethan nodded silently. He didn't know what to say, but his eyes carried understanding, the kind that only comes from surviving loss. "I'm sorry," he said gently. Grace gave a faint smile. "You don't have to be. I think maybe I just needed a reason to bring it back to life." That evening, as Ethan left, the air between them felt different. Lighter, warmer. Grace stood by the porch, watching him walk down the quiet street. There was something about him, his humility, his honesty, that reminded her of the goodness she once believed still existed in people. Days turned into weeks. The garden transformed into a small sanctuary. Colorful blooms framed the fence. A stone path led to the old bench, now clean and polished. Grace sometimes sat there with a book while Ethan worked, their silences comfortable, filled with unspoken respect. But outside the fence, the world had started to notice. Neighbors whispered as they passed by. Some smirked, others exchanged knowing glances. "The cop widow's got herself a helper, huh?" one woman said loudly near the mailbox. Funny how she smiles more these days. Grace heard. She pretended not to care, but the words stung. Ethan noticed too, the sideways looks, the mocking laughter. He said nothing, but a quiet storm began to build inside him. Summer rolled deeper into Michigan, and the once-forgotten garden now bloomed like a hidden paradise. The air smelled of jasmine and fresh soil. Grace often found herself pausing in the mornings just to admire the colors that now filled her backyard, and red roses, purple lilacs, and bright daisies dancing in the wind. Ethan had turned the place into something alive, something hopeful. But beyond the fence, things weren't as peaceful. Neighbors had started to talk. The gossip began small, like distant murmurs, and soon spread through every porch and coffee shop corner. A young homeless man visiting a widow police officer's home almost every day. It was too tempting for people to stay silent. Some whispered that Grace had lost her judgment. Others smirked and claimed Ethan was using her kindness for his own gain. Ethan heard it first when he went to buy fertilizer from a local store. The cashier, a man in his 40s, smirked as he handed over the bag. "I guess working for a lady cop pays better than digging through dumpsters, huh?" Ethan froze. His ears burned, but he said nothing. He only lowered his eyes, took the bag, and walked out quietly. But every step home felt heavier. At the house, Grace noticed the tension in his face. "Ethan, are you all right?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then forced a small smile. "Yeah, just tired, that's all." Grace didn't press further, but she could sense the change. Later that night, while washing dishes, she overheard two of her colleagues outside her office window during a patrol shift. "You've heard about Miller, right?" one whispered. "The widow. She's got some kid living in her garden half the time." Grace's heart sank. She stood frozen by the sink, her hands still wet with soap. It wasn't just the neighbors anymore, even her fellow officers had started to talk. The next morning at the precinct, her captain called her into his office. "Grace," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you've always been one of our best, but people are talking. You need to be careful. A police officer's reputation isn't just personal, it reflects on all of us." Grace nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I understand, sir." When she came home that evening, Ethan was trimming the bushes near the fence. She didn't greet him with her usual warmth. Her mind was clouded with doubt and exhaustion. "You can finish early today," she said, avoiding eye contact. Ethan paused, confused by her tone. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, not at all," she replied quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But as Ethan left that day, he could feel something breaking. The garden was still alive, but the air between them had turned heavy, full of things neither dared to say aloud. That night, Grace sat alone on the porch, staring at the moonlight spilling across the flowers. The whispers had won a small battle, and she didn't know how to silence them. The days that followed were strangely quiet. The sound of Ethan's rake brushing against the soil still echoed in the backyard, but the laughter, the small talks over lemonade, and the warm exchanges were gone. Grace had built a wall of silence around herself, not out of anger, but out of fear. Fear of losing her reputation, fear of being misunderstood, fear of caring too much for someone society had already labeled as beneath her. Ethan felt it deeply. Every morning when he arrived, Grace would give a polite nod from the porch before heading inside. No more coffee breaks, no more shared meals. The garden looked alive, yet everything between them felt cold. One afternoon, as the golden light filtered through the trees, Ethan placed the watering can aside and stood near the fence, staring at the road beyond. He could hear faint voices, a few teenagers snickering from across the street. "There he is! The cop's boy toy," one of them shouted. Laughter followed. Ethan clenched his jaw but didn't turn around. He'd endured insults his whole life, but this one hurt differently. It wasn't just about him, it was about her. He didn't want his presence to bring Grace more pain. When he finally mustered the courage, he knocked gently on her door that evening. Grace opened it, surprised to see him standing there, his hands trembling slightly. "Grace," he said softly, "maybe I shouldn't come anymore. I don't want to cause trouble for you." Her eyes widened. "Ethan, you don't have to," he interrupted gently, his voice breaking. "People are talking. They think things that aren't true. You've worked your whole life to earn respect. I can't be the reason you lose it." Grace stood silent, her hand still on the doorframe. The air between them grew heavy, filled with words neither could say. Finally, she whispered, "If you leave, who will take care of the garden?" Ethan looked down, a faint, pained smile on his lips. "You'll find someone better." Grace's eyes glistened. "That's not what I meant," she said, almost under her breath. They stood there, two lonely souls divided by the world's judgment. Then, unable to bear the weight in his chest, Ethan turned and walked away into the fading light. Grace watched his silhouette disappear down the quiet Michigan street, her heart pounding with regret. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window staring at the empty garden. The flowers still bloomed, but they looked different, as if the color had drained from them the moment Ethan walked out. For the first time in years, she realized how much life he had brought into her home. In another corner of town, Ethan lay awake on his thin mattress at the shelter, replaying her voice in his head. Every part of him wanted to go back to tell her how he felt, but he was convinced the distance was the only way to protect her. Yet deep inside, both of them knew this wasn't an ending. It was the silence before something bigger, something truer. A week passed in silence. The garden that once glowed with laughter and life now looked lifeless despite its colors. Grace spent her evenings staring out the kitchen window, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug. Every petal reminded her of him, of Ethan's quiet smile, of the way he'd kneel in the soil as if each plant was a fragile miracle. Yet she couldn't bring herself to call him back. Pride, fear, and the noise of judgment from others had built an invisible wall around her heart. One evening, as the rain poured over the Michigan streets, Grace sat alone in her living room. The house was too quiet. The clock ticked loudly, each second echoing through her loneliness. She finally realized what she had lost. Maesté, not just a helper, but someone who made her remember how it felt to care, to hope, to feel alive again. Suddenly, headlights flashed through her window. A small figure stood outside her gate, drenched from the storm. Grace's heart jumped. She hurried to open the door, and there he was. Ethan, soaked to the bone, clutching something under his jacket, a bunch of freshly picked wildflowers. "Ethan," she exclaimed, "what are you doing here?" "You'll get sick." He stood there, breathing heavily, rain dripping from his hair. "I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice trembling. "Every day, I told myself to forget. But I can't." "Grace, I didn't mean to make your life harder. I just wanted to make it better." Grace froze, her breath catching in her throat. He took a step closer, his eyes shining with sincerity. "I know I'm poor. I know people talk, but when I worked in your garden, it didn't feel like just work. It felt like I finally had a reason to wake up. You're the first person who ever saw me as more than trash." Tears welled in her eyes. The rain outside softened to a drizzle, and the faint sound of thunder rolled across the distance. She reached out slowly, taking the wet flowers from his hands. Her voice broke. "Ethan, you don't need to apologize. It's me who's been a coward. I was so afraid of what people would say that I forgot to ask what my heart wanted." He looked up, startled. Grace continued, her voice soft but firm. "You reminded me what kindness looks like. You made this house feel alive again, and I don't care what anyone thinks anymore." For a moment, they just stood there, the sound of rain filling the silence between them. Then Grace smiled through her tears. "Come inside. You're home now." Ethan hesitated, his lips trembling. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Yes, I've never been more sure of anything." That night, they sat together by the warm fireplace. Ethan spoke little, afraid it might all be a dream. Grace poured him hot tea, her hand brushing his gently. Outside, the storm passed, leaving behind the scent of wet earth and new beginnings. For the first time in years, neither of them felt alone. By the next morning, the storm clouds had cleared, but the real storm was just beginning. Grace's neighbors had seen Ethan arrive the previous night. The sight of a young man entering a police officer's home under the rain became the newest fuel for gossip. By noon, whispers had already spread across the block like wildfire. "Did you see him?" "That boy again," muttered Mrs. Larson from across the street, peeking through her blinds. "She let him in during the storm." Imagine what must be going on inside that house. At the grocery store, two off-duty officers exchanged quiet smirks when Grace walked by. "Guess Sergeant Miller's found herself some company," one joked. Grace pretended not to hear, but her heart tightened. The same people she'd once worked beside with pride now looked at her with suspicion. Ethan noticed it too. When he went to pick up supplies for the garden, people stared longer than before. Some whispered, others laughed. It wasn't just humiliation, it was a deep ache that came from knowing he'd become a target again, just for caring about someone above his station. That afternoon, Grace came home looking exhausted, her eyes red from holding back tears. Ethan was trimming the rose bushes and looked up immediately. "Grace, what happened?" She shook her head, forcing a weak smile. "It's nothing. Just work," but he could tell she was lying. "Is it because of me?" he asked quietly. Grace stopped, her silence confirming his fear. He turned away, his jaw tight. "I knew this would happen. I never wanted to ruin your life." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "You didn't ruin anything, Ethan." People talk because they don't understand. They always need someone to judge. He faced her, eyes full of pain. "They don't just judge you. They judge me too. To them, I'll always be the kid who digs through trash. They think I'm not good enough for you." Grace took a deep breath. "Maybe they're right about one thing," she said softly. Ethan looked at her, confused, hurt flashing across his face. But before he could speak, she added, "You are different. You're not like them. You're honest, humble, kind. They can't understand that, so they twist it into something ugly." For a moment, neither spoke. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the garden, painting them in gold and silence. Then Grace reached out and placed her hand gently over his dirt-stained one. "I'm tired of living by their rules, Ethan. I've spent years hiding behind my badge trying to look strong. But strength isn't about appearances, it's about standing for what feels right." Ethan's throat tightened. What if standing for this means losing everything? She smiled faintly. Then maybe it's worth losing. That night, Grace didn't close her blinds. She let the lights stay on, her silhouette visible to anyone who dared to gossip. For the first time, she stopped being afraid of their stares. In that glowing house on a quiet Michigan street, two people finally chose truth over fear. The next morning, a soft mist hung over the Michigan suburb. Grace Gee stood in front of her mirror, buttoning her uniform jacket. Her reflection looked strong, but she could see the faint trace of exhaustion beneath her eyes. The previous night's courage still pulsed in her heart, yet she knew what awaited her outside. More whispers, more judgment, more questioning glances from her peers. She pinned her badge to her chest and whispered to herself, "Let them talk." Then she took a deep breath and left for the station. At work, the stares were sharper than ever. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Even her captain gave her a look that mixed disappointment and pity. By midday, she was called into his office again. "Grace," he began, his tone firm but not cruel. "You know how this looks. The department's image matters. The public talks, and the media listens. People have seen this young man at your house almost every day." Grace folded her hands, steadying her voice. "With all due respect, sir, he's an honest kid. He returned my wallet when he could have taken the money. He's been helping with my garden. That's all." Her captain sighed. "I know you, Grace. You're one of our best. But people don't see what's real. They see what they want to. Be careful before this turns into something that damages your career." Grace nodded and stood to leave, but before she reached the door, she stopped and said quietly, "Sir, maybe it's time people learned that integrity matters more than gossip." Then she walked out, her head high. Back home that evening, Ethan was already there, waiting by the fence, holding a small bouquet of white daisies, the ones he'd planted weeks ago. His face brightened when she appeared, but the concern in his eyes was unmistakable. "You look tired," he said softly. Grace Buzz smiled faintly. "Just another day at the office." He hesitated, then spoke. "Grace, if it's too hard, I can go. I'll find another place to work. I don't want to make things worse." She looked at him for a long moment before replying, "You've made things better, Ethan. You brought life back to this place to me. I won't let anyone take that away." They sat together on the old wooden bench, the same one her husband had built years ago. The flowers swayed around them, glowing under the evening sky. Grace turned to him and said quietly, "When my husband died, I promised myself I'd never let anyone close again. But you reminded me that not all hearts hurt you. Some heal you." Ethan's eyes shimmered. "Grace, I don't know what the future holds. I can't promise wealth or comfort, but I can promise honesty. I can promise to stand by you." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "That's all I've ever needed." As the sun dipped below the rooftops, the garden seemed to bloom brighter than ever, as if nature itself was blessing their decision. Autumn came softly to Michigan, painting the trees with gold and amber hues. The air grew crisp, but inside Grace's home, warmth had begun to bloom again. She and Ethan had found a fragile peace amid the storm of judgment that surrounded them. The world might still whisper, but within the walls of her small house, there was finally honesty, Sapan, the kind that could not be shaken by rumors or rank. Still, the tension outside never truly went away. One morning, as Grace arrived at work, she found a note slipped under her locker door. It was unsigned, but the words stung. A cop should know better than to fall for garbage. For a few moments, she stood frozen, her fingers trembling as she folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket. But instead of tears, something else stirred inside her. Defiance. That evening, when she returned home, she found Ethan raking fallen leaves in the yard. The smell of soil and pine filled the cool air. "You shouldn't have to deal with this anymore," he said quietly before she even spoke. "I can go somewhere else. Maybe out of town. Start over." Grace stepped closer. "And leave everything we've built? Let them win?" He looked up at her, eyes filled with the weary humility she had come to know so well. "Grace, I don't care what they think about me. But they're hurting you. They're questioning your name, your job, your pride. I can't be the reason you lose any of that." Her gaze softened. "You're not the reason, Ethan. They are, because they've forgotten what dignity looks like." She reached into her pocket and handed him the crumpled note. He unfolded it, his jaw tightening. "I've lived my whole life being called trash," he said, voice low. "But when I met you, for the first time, I wanted to be more than what they said I was." Grace took his hand, dirt still on his palm, rough and real. "You already are. You've shown more integrity than most men I've worked with. That's something no badge or title can give." He looked into her eyes, emotion burning behind his quiet expression. "Then let me prove it. Not just by working in your garden, but by standing beside you." For real, Grace's heart skipped. She understood what he meant before he even said it aloud. For a moment, the world around them fell silent. Only the rustle of leaves and the hum of the autumn breeze remained. "I'm not rich," he said finally, "but I'll never let you feel alone again. If you'll let me, Grace, I want to take care of you, not out of pity, but out of love." Tears welled in her eyes. She cupped his cheek gently, whispering, "You already do." That night, she didn't hide her feelings anymore. They talked for hours under the golden porch light, about fear, about love, about how society always finds reasons to divide people. But together, they decided one thing: they would no longer bend to it. Love, they realized, was their quiet rebellion. Winter came early that year in Michigan. The streets glistened with frost, and every breath turned into a small cloud in the cold air. Grace's house looked different now, brighter, warmer, alive. The once abandoned garden had become a small sanctuary, a place where every flower seemed to tell the story of two souls who dared to love despite the world's noise. The wedding was small, just as Grace wanted. There were no fancy decorations or long guest lists, only sincerity. A few of her closest colleagues who truly understood her heart attended, along with neighbors who had once whispered but now watched in silent awe. The ceremony took place right in the backyard, under the same tree where Ethan had first promised to restore her garden. Grace wore a simple cream dress with a silver pin near her collar and the one her late husband had given her during their first year of marriage. She wore it not as a memory of loss, but as a symbol of peace. Ethan, nervous but glowing with quiet pride, wore a second-hand suit Grace had secretly bought him. When he saw her walking toward him, his breath caught. The officiant's words faded into the background as their eyes met. Every hardship, every rumor, every sleepless night now seemed worth it. When Grace took Ethan's hand, her voice trembled softly. "You gave me something I thought I had lost forever. Faith in good hearts. You reminded me that love isn't measured by wealth, but by honesty." Ethan smiled through tears. "You gave me something I never thought I'd find. A home. Not just a roof, but a reason to wake up every morning." When they said, "I do," the cold wind swept through the garden, scattering petals across the air as if nature itself was blessing their union. There was no music, only laughter, clinking teacups, and the smell of warm pie coming from Grace's small kitchen. The guests clapped softly, and a few even wiped tears from their eyes. As evening descended, the garden lights flickered on, wrapping the trees in a soft golden glow. Grace and Ethan sat together on the old wooden bench, the one he had repaired with his own hands. The world around them was silent, except for the faint sound of snow beginning to fall. Ethan looked at her and whispered, "Do you ever regret it? Choosing me? Choosing this life?" Grace smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. "Not for a single second. You turned my loneliness into peace and my fear into courage. That's more than anyone ever gave me." From the sidewalk, a few children passing by pointed at the lights in the garden. "That's the cop's house," one of them said. "It's so pretty." Grace chuckled softly. "See? Even they notice beauty now." The rumors had faded, replaced by quiet respect. In time, people began to see what they truly were, two broken hearts that had mended each other. As snow blanketed the garden, Grace whispered, "You and I, Ethan, we bloomed where no one thought flowers could grow." And under the Michigan winter sky, love, simple, honest, and brave, stood tall against the cold.